great to be with you today for another Leadership Greater Washington Frontline conversation. We want to thank PNC Bank for being the sponsor for these series. They've been very helpful for us to have these conversations with leaders around the region. And today we have Ibrahim Mumin, who is a longtime leader in the Washington region. Started off in, was it Columbus, Georgia?
That's correct.
And working on some civil rights issues there, and then came to the DC area by coming to Howard University. Was active in some of the protests and different discussions that happened in the late 60s here at Howard and other places. And then moved to Shaw and really has become sort of a community leader for Shaw and has worked with the city on several of the major projects that have come forward in the last few years, like the Convention Center, the Marriott Marquis Hotel, the City Center DC, Capital One Arena, and all of that. So, Ibrahim, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Doug, thank you for inviting me to join the Frontline conversations and also to provide an opportunity for the people of Shaw to tell their story about our rich history and also the promise of what's to happen in the future.
So how are you? I always start off asking how you're doing personally. How's your health? How's your mental health? How are things going in this time of COVID for you?
Well, I'm doing fine. Like other families, I'm talking with you today from my home here in Shaw. My wife and I have been here in this house 37 years. We love it. When we moved into the neighborhood, there were a lot of issues, but we've been sequestered and quarantined and trying to learn all the new normal. And I've learned how to participate in forums like this, Zoom and other things which I don't know about, but my grandchildren tell me all about them. And so we're doing fine. And I just looking forward to an election in 69 days from now, because, you know, we want to see a change in our country.
So are you ready to break out of the COVID quarantine? Are you tired of this, or how's that going for you?
Well, there's no question that any normal person would be tired of being sequestered if you're not used to this. And basically, I'm a civic and a business leader, but I've been very active my whole life. And so this is different. And so on the one hand, I want to break out, but on the other hand, I've got to listen to the scientists and the medical people and other people who say the things that we must do in order to be safe for ourselves and for others around us. And so we've got to be guided by this. I tell someone, one of my young friends was upset, saying they were, what do you call it? They had quarantine fatigue. And I said, you need to understand what it was like with people like Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, when they decided to boycott the buses. They had to walk, not in the spring and the summer, but in the wintertime. And the boycott took 381 days before they had a resolution. So we got to suck it up a little bit as the new people, and because we've been about, what, 5 or 6 months, and many people are ready to raise the white flag.
Well, we're getting a lot of shout outs in the chat room for you from Cheryl Kravitz and Faye Coleman and a lot of others. So
good.
Very nice. Very nice. So let's talk about your history a little bit. Coming to Washington, D.C. at Howard University, being part of the demonstrations there, being part of what happened in D.C. after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Tell us about what was life like back then in the late 60s here in D.C.
Doug, you need to understand, and to my audience, I grew up in Columbus, Georgia, which is about 90 miles south of Atlanta, for those people not familiar with the area. And in 1963, I made a major decision. I joined the youth council of the NAACP, and we targeted the Bradley Library, which is a segregated library, the central library in Columbus, Georgia, to try and get library cards. There were two libraries, the colored library and the white library. We chose the Bradley Library, and I got arrested there with about 21 other high school students. not because we had done anything bad, but because we were blacks, and blacks were not permitted to go to that library. To move forward, I came to Howard University in 1965, and my family was very happy, particularly my mother, because she thought I was going to spend a lot of time in jail, because when I got arrested at the library, the judge said, "Don't bring him back before me." So we tried to dodge the judge and be away from that. But when I came to Howard, I got involved in the student movement, in the movement against the war in Vietnam. And in 1973, I joined the Nation of Islam, and that's how I first came to Shaw. The mosque here in Washington was called Masjid Muhammad, Masjid Mosque, and I joined that in 1973. Stayed active even though I was a Muslim, and we didn't do a lot of involvement in citizen participation at the time. But in 1985, something got my attention. We were trying to get Nelson Mandela and many other political prisoners out of jail. And I had the pleasure of getting arrested in front of the South African Embassy in 1985, trying to get the United States government, which was propping up the apartheid regime in South Africa, to come forward and institute sanctions. In 1988, I joined an organization called the National Conference of Christians and Jews. I later became the first Muslim in the country to ever serve as chairman. They had about 50 or 60 chapters at the time. And it was a major shift for me, because when I first joined the Nation of Islam, I believed all whites were devils. And my opinions changed. When Imam Warif Muhammad took over, I embraced universal Islam, and there was no place for racism in Islam. And in 1996, Doug, I became the chairman, and the executive director was Cheryl Kravitz, who I think is on the call today, came shortly afterwards. And it was an interesting scenario, because you had a Jewish woman who was the executive director, and a so-called Black Muslim who was the chairman. And so we had a lot of fun going to some of the places. And I've stayed involved, and that was my civic life. In my professional life, I was doing community economic development, worked on the Verizon Center project, the Convention Center project, Marriott Marquis, City Center, City Market at O Street, and also some social issues. I was the lead organizer in preventing the YMCA from tearing down the Anthony Bowen YMCA on 12th Street, which is now called the Thurgood Marshall Center. So since about 15 years old, Doug, I've been active in civic responsibility, and that came about as a result of my mama, Viola Porter.
No, that's a great story. I've always loved people who basically say, I've got a responsibility to help others around me. I've got a calling to public service in different ways. So that's just what you told us, and you've been arrested a few times because of that, but you've been fighting for the right things all along. Now, you said you moved to Shaw because the mosque was there.
Yeah.
What made you stay in Shaw? What made you say, this is my community and we are going to revitalize it?
I moved to Shaw in 1976, and at the time that I became a Muslim, attending Masjid Muhammad, or many people know it as the Nation's Mosque. I was living in Adams Morgan, and I used to have to walk to the mosque because I didn't have a car, and I was doing that in those days. And I was fascinated with the neighborhood, and as I started reading and learning about Shaw, even though at that time it was in bad shape, Doug. Remember now, after the assassination of Dr. King, there was a lot of burning and destruction in the Shaw neighborhood. And many people, middle-class blacks and whites, they were fleeing Shaw at the time. But I loved the neighborhood, and then I was very fortunate in 1978, Lola Singletary, who's a minister in charge of a group called a community-based organization called the Shaw Pact, offered me a job as a community organizer. And my love for the neighborhood deepened, because this was a neighborhood that had seen 2 blocks from where I live right now, Doug, Carter G. Woodson's home, which has now been converted to a museum. We had Duke Ellington, we had Mary McLeod Bethune, and we had U Street, we had Ben's Chili Bowl, the Howard Theater, the Lincoln Theater, Madame Evante, Thurgood Marshall worked over at the YMCA. So there was just, this neighborhood, as I say, was just oozing with history. and it was just exciting to be here. And I had the ability to look past the devastation and the decay and see what the potential was and is for the neighborhood.
So how do you, Faye Coleman's got a question here for you. And it's, we're looking at sort of overdevelopment. We're looking at a lot of gentrification. How do you revitalize something and not lose the cultural character of it, not lose the essence of who it was, and have it just become something sort of cookie cutter that we see anywhere in the country? And Faye wants to know, what advice do you have for current community development activists who want to preserve the cultural and historic vibrancy of their neighborhoods that are undergoing revitalization? It's a very tough issue to deal with. We dealt with it in Silver Spring, dealt with it in other places. And DC is, I think gentrification is probably the word now, and has been in DC for what to do.
That's a very great question that Faye posed to us, and it's a difficult question because, one, we have to recognize that we live in a capitalistic economy, and some things we can't get around. We can't stop someone who wants to sell their house for $50,000 and gets an offer for $75,000 from taking that. But I think what the government can do is to use its leverage to make sure that there are projects that take place that help long-time residents and long-time business people. And that means that when there are projects like at 7th and Rhode Island Avenue and other places, and we have to support the ones that are still here. We have projects here that have low-income people like Lincoln Westmoreland, Channing Phillips Apartment, Foster House, Gibson Plaza, Immaculate Conception, United House of Prayer Housing. These are some areas that we have, but all of these things are at risk if we don't continue to support them. And we have to make sure that when the DEMPED and the other people who develop projects, whether they're old schools or vacant land or other things, make sure that there's a requirement that low and moderate income people are included. And also we can look out to some of our partners who are well-financed, some of these national organizations that have trust funds and things. They can come in and help underwrite the cost of the expensive land in neighborhoods like Shaw to make sure that low-income people can stay in the neighborhood. So it's a difficult question.
So Scott Kratz from the 11th Street Bridge Project seems to be working very hard at that particular question, and he's setting aside land and other things for lower income households. He's in next year's class with us, so we're very excited about that. But that's something that's happening right now in the district that I think really will give us some answers as to how you do that and what's the best way to achieve that. So very impressive.
And I should say, Doug, what's also important is that this is a neighborhood where we have many seniors. And the good news is that we have Foster House and we've got the Hodge and a couple of other things, but we've got to make sure some of the seniors are homeowners. We've got to make sure that the government does things to make sure that they're not priced out because of taxes, even though they may own their houses. You're still responsible for taxes and insurance. And that can be problematic for people if you're on a fixed income, and there are some things to help alleviate that, but it's still not enough because you can reduce the amount of taxes, but if each year it continues to increase, after a while you're priced out of the market and you're forced to sell, not because you want to live. We should be trying to embrace the concept of aging in place, and we have many people in the Shaw neighborhood who would be eligible for that. But the city council and the mayor have to make sure that they're doing things to make sure that the people who were heroes and sheroes and stayed in Shaw during the lean years benefit when the prosperity comes.
Yeah, you hear a lot about, and I heard a lot of it in past years, of people saying, I just want, I've lived here my adult life. I love this neighborhood I'm in. I want to just retire here and stay here, but I'm not going to be able to afford it. With, as you said, the taxes and the cost of living and other things. And we are driving we're driving some stability out of neighborhoods when that happens. We're driving sort of the history of the neighborhood out when that happens. And it's a very tough challenge. Again, as you go through revitalizing areas. So I like the idea of working with the seniors, helping them, and making, they're the ones who were there in the bad times. They should be able to participate in the good times. They should benefit.
It's precisely true. It's the worst kind of situation in a society when you have people, in addition to just the real estate, the bricks and mortar, these people have a lot of history. They have a lot of insight. They can help a lot in terms of providing mentorship for young people coming in the neighborhood. And so it's a win-win. It's got to be a win-win. And we as a city and a region, we have to decide on what kind of city we want. And if you want a city where it's all gentrified and you have all luxury condominiums and all lawyers and lobbyists and other people, then they will do that. But in order to have something different, the city government has to have the policy, or else we're the victims of a kind of social Darwinism, where it's the survival of the fittest. And we can't win that battle when someone puts a house on the market based on an appraisal that happens, in my block, and the house sells in 2 days. And I asked the resident, how did it sell so fast? And he said, what happened was someone came in and gave me a cash offer that was more than what the asking price was. And so it's gone. And so those are the market forces. And so what we need is some kind of government, a nonprofit intervention that can help out, people who have hardly no income. We have now $1-2 million homes and condos here in Shaw. That wasn't the case when I moved here in 1976. But the question you have to ask is, what kind of income does a person have to afford a $1 or $2 million house or condo? And we have people who have almost no income. And with this pandemic, things are going to be worse probably before they get better.
Well, you've got as you said, the people buying those houses, it's not a family moving in. It's an investor looking to assemble property, looking to flip it, looking to whatever, to make a lot of money and keep moving on. There's no sort of commitment to the neighborhood itself. That's a real challenge for us. I want to shift topics a little bit if we could, and we've got a question from Cheryl Kravitz about the current climate and race relations and what we're seeing. We just saw Kenosha. It's just one bad story after another. Can you sort of compare and contrast what was going in the late 60s, 70s, and what you're seeing today? And what do you think some of the things that we need to do to help alleviate some of the suffering?
I think what happened in the 60s when I was involved, it was in Georgia, it was clearer. Georgia was one of the southern states. It was part of the Confederacy. And so there was this understanding that you expected certain kind of things in the South. And I tell my young people, we were happy to get involved. And even though we got arrested, we knew that if we could get to court, the court would support us, because when I got arrested in Columbus, Georgia, in 1963, this was 9 years after Brown versus Board of Education with Thurgood Marshall. What's interesting now is that the brutality just seems to be pervasive throughout the country. And George Floyd was not killed in the South. He was killed in Minnesota. The brother who was shot 7 times in the back the other day was shot not in the South, but in Wisconsin. And so you have this mentality, the kind of a Gestapo, where years ago, I was involved with something called community policing, Doug. You may remember that from your days in your government. And at the federal level, the Justice Department and other people threw out all those things dealing with community policing. And now what they are after is sort of like an occupying army mentality. With no respect, for the people. And I tell people that can't work in neighborhoods like Shaw or Kenosha, Wisconsin, Minneapolis, and other places. It didn't work in Vietnam. It didn't work in Iraq and Afghanistan. you got to have something with the people. And part of, when I was involved with NCCJ, our mission was to fight bias, bigotry, and racism. And we did that through education, advocacy, and conflict resolution. So there's got to be people talking to each other, and we've got to make sure that people are working together. At the mosque that I attend, we have a saying: "It's our community, our responsibility." And whether you're white or black, or Latino, or Asian, Native American, Christian, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist, we've all got to work together. I think Martin, King said we're all in the same boat. We're tied together. And injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I think one of the big cancers that we have now is people have this idea, Doug, is that it's somebody else's fault, somebody else's problem. And so I can sit back and not do anything. And I'm reminded of the album, I think it was back in the 80s, that I used to love. Michael Jackson said, and I think it was called Bad. And one of the songs on there was called Man in the Mirror. And essentially the song over and over again says, if you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and then make the change. And too many people now are saying, in order to make the world a better place, I'm going to start with the president, the vice president, the senator, the police chief, the county executive, other things. And what's missing is, what do ordinary citizens need to be doing? And I remember when I was in school, reading the speech of John Kennedy at his first inaugural. He said, ask not what America can do for you, but what you can do for America. And we've got things that trouble me now when I see, when I was a college student, I was very socially conscious, and I see pictures of college students with all of the stuff that's going on in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a racial justice crisis. They're partying, and not caring about social distancing and how their behavior can adversely affect other people.
So how do we get back to that? How do we get back to that sort of this common core of responsibility for others? And the mask issue is really just a small piece of it, but people are screaming, how dare you trample my rights? I don't have to wear a mask. I can do whatever I want. I don't care if I get you sick or you get me sick. We do have, I heard somebody say, we do have laws saying you have to wear pants, and nobody's complaining about that, but we can't wear a mask. And to me, I thought it was, basically it's wear a mask, be a patriot, do something for the good of your country to help your country get over this pandemic so that the economy can get going again. And yet we've got people screaming individual rights. It's the right of myself trumps any other rights out there, no pun intended.
I think what happened is that, I'm not sure you'll ever get everybody, but I remember when this same kind of discussion happened when we were talking about seatbelts. There were people who said, okay, if you choose to wear one, that's okay, but don't require me to do that. And over time, most jurisdictions came to require seatbelts as part of the law. The same thing like with smoking on airplanes. Wasn't it kind of silly that we used to say, well, you can smoke. I'm old enough to remember that you could smoke in the first few rows, but back in the back, you didn't. This is the non-smoking section, and anybody who's got any sense would know that the smoke would travel throughout the whole compartment of the airplane. And so eventually people got to the point where, okay, no smoking. Same in restaurants. And so I think those people who care have to get engaged. And I say to people, November 3rd is not just an election for president, but down the whole ballot, local officials and other people. If we're sick and tired of what the postmaster is doing, we can change the person who appoints the postmaster. And the same thing with, if we're sick and tired of some of the crazy things that have been coming out of the Supreme Court, we can change the thing of the man who appoints Supreme Court justices. And we can, change that. So I think it's sort of like I'm an adult educator. I do a lot of training, and we would say that the instructor needs to model the behavior that you want the students to demonstrate. if you want your students to do something, then what you should do is be modeling that behavior so they can see that. And I think we start Booker T. Washington in his classic autobiography, Up from Slavery, said, cast your bucket down where you are. And as I was saying when we were chatting before we got started, I think Leadership Greater Washington is in a unique position to provide leadership on this issue. Now, this is a crisis, and a crisis is our leadership organization should not be just something you do in the good times. Again, another quote from Martin, he used to say, the challenge is not where you are in comfort and convenience, but where do you stand during conflict and controversy? And so I don't know, Doug, how many people who are members of Leadership Washington now, but we should be circling the wagons and reaching out to all of the classes. You know, I know my classes some years ago in 93, of course, we were the best class, the Magnificent Seven. But I know that there's some of the best and brightest in this region are part of our alums. And I'd like to see us continue to do what you're doing. I forget what you call it, our was it weekly newsletter? What's it called? Something action?
The weekly lead we put out, yeah.
Yeah, I think
that's about what the members are doing, yeah.
And I'm suggesting that we go down even deeper and figure out affinity groups that can work together on issues, and Leadership Greater Washington can help facilitate that, I think.
Well, we are working with other groups, and I appreciate those comments. That's great advice for us. We sponsored a civil rights learning journey in the South with the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers. So Leadership Greater Washington and RAG put this on, and we went down, and it was a very lightning trip. It was about a 4 or 5 day trip. It was very depressing, not just because we were at everywhere you sort of went. It was the site where here's where the 4 little girls got bombed to death. Here's where Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Here's where this person was killed. Here's where the 3 civil rights workers were killed. I mean, that's depressing all by itself. But the other thing that was very depressing was a lot of the things they were fighting for back then was around the right to vote. Mm-hmm. And we find ourselves, 50 plus years later, still sort of fighting for the same thing. It's kind of, it's depressing. It's discouraging in a lot of ways. We have made an awful lot of progress. We still have a long way to go. And I hope people don't get sort of fed up and say, well, it's not worth it. I'm struck by this comment that Mother Teresa once made when somebody asked her, you know, you're out there helping people who are dying, you're providing care for them, and yet nothing's changed. There's more people out there than ever. They're dying in the streets. You haven't really made you're not successful. And she basically said, well, the Lord didn't call me to be successful. He called me to be faithful and just keep doing what I'm called to do. And I think that's what we have to keep plugging away at, keep working on these.
Let me just say I got an award last year from Columbus, Georgia. I got an award from the mayor and the city council for my involvement, and essentially they passed a resolution. All 21 of us got the award who had been arrested at the Bradley Library for demonstrating. And my son joked and said, Dad, it only took them 57 years to realize they had made a mistake. Essentially, it was an apology. But I wasn't bitter. I went to a wonderful program where we talked to adults as well as some high school students, which was very enriching. But and someone asked me, how do I keep from getting depressed or down? And the point that you mentioned. And what I said is that I always saw myself as a freedom fighter, and as a freedom fighter, you either win or you die. There's no retirement. Even though I'm trying to transition into doing less work in terms of my professional life. But the other thing is that when we used to go to those mass meetings, Doug, at the churches, because we knew that we could be killed or beaten when we went out on those demonstrations, and we sang "We Shall Overcome." And those of you who know the song, there are like about 6 standard verses, and we used to add one verse that said, "And God is on our side," and that was powerful because what happened is that we were fighting people who called themselves Christians, but they believed that their God endorsed slavery and segregation. And we said, our God doesn't say that. And we believe what you're saying is blasphemous. And that was what motivated us. And I have a Christian friend who's a minister, Reverend Eutha Hartman Cromwell, and she sent me a recent sermon that she spoke, and she said that the title was "Doing Our Part," and that was kind of what I shared a moment ago. What's happening is that we have many other people who say, I'm not going to do my part. They can tell you 10,000 things Doug Duncan should do, but they don't say anything that they can do. And so what I'm saying is that we're all in this together. Let's put the problems in the middle of the table and use all of our assets and resources to attack the problem. And there's some solution, because God will continue to bless us, and we'll be punished if we don't. You know, as you know, America has probably the largest concentrations of people incarcerated in all the westernized developed nations. And so what's wrong with this picture? Why do we have so many people incarcerated? And then even now, you have people saying, in order to solve the problems in Washington, D.C. and Wisconsin and Minneapolis and other places, you just need more cops, more jails, more National Guards, you know. And it's kind of a sad analysis, because I remember looking at some data, and about $150 a day it takes for each person who's in prison. So is that a long-term strategy that we can sustain? What about the loss in talent for all those people who are incarcerated? Anyway, I'll stop. I'm passionate about that.
But do you think we're at a turning point now? A lot of the guests we've had on this program have talked about it feels different to them this time. There's more people involved in the protest. It's gotten a lot more people's attention. They really think something different is going to happen, not just in criminal justice, but in sort of relations across the board. So what are your thoughts on that?
I do think that there's some change taking place, but I think one of my friends have an expression of saying, you know, like in 2016, the Democrats were playing checkers and the Republicans were playing chess. We've got to understand what the rules are, and even though there may be some laws that are not the best, we have to use the current rules until we can, you know, make changes. When we were involved in the demonstrations in Columbus, Georgia, there were no white people with us. All of us were Black. The NAACP, field secretaries, and all of the students were Black. And I think I told you, when I joined the Nation of Islam in 1973, I believe all whites were devils. You know, and it wasn't hard for me to believe that. But when I continued to study and to read, I understood, you know, the Quran, and also meeting good white people, you know, who were doing things that I couldn't intellectually be honest and rationalize that position. And I think what I'm seeing now in the demonstrations in the cities, the many peaceful demonstrations, even though the president tries to talk about the minorities, the peaceful demonstration includes, you know, Blacks and whites and Latinos and Asians and other people. And I think what we got to do, though, I'm interested, Doug, in moving beyond just the demonstrations. I want to also make sure that we have some policy changes. That means that we have to, some of the people who are in there, who are elected officials, need to be replaced. You know, they need to be fired, and we need to replace them with people who think like we think, so that America and the policies of the government represent how the demographics of this country look. One of the demonstrations I was in, and one of the chants that I love, is we had all these different people demonstrating down at the Supreme Court, where, you know, it says equal justice under the law, but obviously that wasn't happening. But one of the chants is, this is what America looks like. America looks like, so if you're part of a group and you're convening a meeting, and you see that there are no Black people there, whether or not you're on a local level or, you know, a corporate level, you know, you need to do some things, you know, so that the organization that you are part of becomes part of the solution and not just part of the problem.
think a lot of organizations are doing that now more seriously than they ever have before. So I hope you're right. I hope this really is a movement, not a moment that we're experiencing now. We certainly need it. We certainly need it.
And what I say to Doug, to people in my neighborhood, I did an interview about a month ago with a reporter from the Washington Post, and she was doing something about Shaw. I think it appeared in the real estate section of the Post. And she said, tell me how the neighborhood really changed, how the things really improved once white people came here. And I was really insulted because what I explained to the reporter is that me and other people with my same paint job, you know, who are African Americans, we did the heavy lifting in fighting against open air drug markets, crime, and drive-by shootings, and bullets flying, and innocent people being killed. We did that and made it safe for people to move in. Many people who are coming in now in a gentrified neighborhood. But you know, I said my wife and I, Carol and I, we didn't sit back and hope that the neighborhood would improve. We rolled up our sleeves and we were active participants in it happening. And that's what I say to people concerning the 69 days left to the election. Get involved, do what you can, make sure you're registered to vote, prepared to vote. Call your relatives and your friends in other states and ask them to get involved and to get engaged. And also after November the 3rd, we've got to stay engaged so that we can begin to make sure that this country gets back on the course that it's a freedom and justice for all the people. And I tell people, look, I'm for law and order, but you know, it just seems like law and order is just for certain kinds of people. You know, if you're Flynn or some of the other people who get pardoned, that's one thing. But what about a person who's innocent who gets shot in the back, or somebody who's just jogging in their neighborhood? I've got children and grandchildren. This is a real issue for me. And you can't, the nature of how we live is that you can't ignore this problem and say that because, you know, I live 30 miles outside of an urban area, that this doesn't touch me. It touches everybody.
So what, over these last few months, with COVID, with the unrest, with everything that's with the economy failing, with climate change still there, what are any leadership lessons you've learned as you've gone through this?
Yeah, one of the lessons I've learned is that as leaders, we have to be nimble and flexible and pay attention to what's going on. My wife is a writer, and some people out there know that she wrote her flagship play is Where Eagles Fly. They were scheduled to do a summer program, and because of COVID-19, their first thought was to cancel it. But then they decided to do it and just do it virtually. And the interesting thing is how the students did, and they were very creative with the assignment that they were given. They had to do the play and do it virtually, and it was just wonderful. We had a young lady who was a director, who was a sophomore at Sarah Lawrence College, who came in and organized them, and so they're in the process of finishing that. I talked to a friend, George Jones. Some of you may know that Bread for the City is located here in Shaw. They got started here. And George was telling me how they work with some folks from Amazon to come out and deliver packages to people, because people before March 15th, they were coming to the center to pick up their groceries, and that wasn't safe. And that was just a real interesting thing. And the other thing is that I'm a part of a group called Positive Black Folks in Action. And every year we would have a celebration of Malcolm X's birthday on May 19th. We had it planned for Walter Daniel Library. And again, when COVID came in, the question was, what do we do? So we decided not to cancel it, but to do it virtually. And so we decided to do it. This is the first time I really was on a situation using Zoom. And we did it. And what we do is that, what's the expression? Sometimes a broken play ends up being a touchdown. We had people not only from DC, but we had people from Seattle, Washington, Georgia, California. We had someone from Cape Verde Islands and someone from Belize. And the keynote speaker was Ibrahim Rasool, the former ambassador from the United States from South Africa to the United States, and he was speaking to us from his home in Cape Town. So it expanded my horizon and really brought to mind how this whole situation is really global, and this social media really helps to bring that home.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. A lot of the unrest that we've seen is not just here in the United States, but it's across the world. It's in countries and cities across the world, which I take as a very encouraging sign. And I do think that having to go virtual, using Zoom and other ways to connect people has brought some of that about, where you're now talking, interacting with people in different countries and different continents that we never would have if we were in sort of a normal environment of you go to this meeting, you go to that meeting, go to that event in person. So it's been very, very helpful to us at Leadership Greater Washington in terms of expanding our outreach as well.
Yeah, like I said, I'm just glad, and I think everybody should be soul searching now. This is it's sort of like going to the gas station and somebody who was getting gas before you left, and you got to hit the reset button. I think COVID-19 is giving us a chance to hit the reset button and to look at things that are operating in our society. I'm not unmindful of what happened when the data comes out and says that African Americans and other people of color are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And why is that? And so when you look at people's access to healthcare, you can have 10,000 doctors in Washington, but if I don't have access to them, how do we make this work? How is it, I think one of the things I love about our brother, John Lewis, and he would say, if you see something that's not right, that's not fair, and that's not just, do something. And I think too many people are not doing anything, and we think we can sit at home and not be harmed. I had a friend once who used to give this story. He said, if you've got a barn full of corn and the person in the farm next to you has a barn that's empty, that's going to be a problem over time. And in Islam, there's the hadith that says, none are believers unless you love for your brother and sister that which you love for yourself. And part of the reason that I stay involved is that even though I'm a Muslim, I grew up in the Sunday school at Hopewell Baptist Church in Upator, Georgia. And they would just say all the time is that unto whom much is given, much is required. And we've been given much. And if we don't use the much, the privilege that we've been given, I think we're going to be punished.
So Ibrahim, thank you very much for this conversation. I want to shift a little bit.
Okay.
Glenn Howard has basically said, very nice to hear all this, but what music are you listening to now?
The music that I'm listening to now is the same music that I've been listening to all along. It's in my head that makes me go and know that there's hope. I think my Christian friends, that there's a verse that says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And we say in Islam, God is greater, as some of you all see sometimes in the media. They try to Allahu Akbar. God is greater, and my theme is it's our community, our responsibility. And I think God has blessed us to go forward with doing all of these things. And my grandfather used to say, boy, you need to understand that when God made you, he didn't break the mold. And I used to ask him, well, Papa, what do you mean? He said, you need to understand that there's some other good people out there too. And he went even further, Doug. He said, when God made you, he didn't break the mold. There's some other good people, and it's your job to find them. And so the issue is, how do we do that as people of faith, and whatever your faith is or lack of faith? We're just talking about fairness in what is going on in this country. And I think what we've got to do is to turn this situation around where people don't have faith and trust in the head of the national government in our country. if a classic example is that I used to live when Carol and I first got married, we lived in a building, a high rise, 12 stories. And there was a crime committed in the parking lot. The police came and they would say, well, who saw anything? And all the people walked away. And so I said, what's wrong with this picture? And what's wrong with this picture, Doug, is that none of the people trusted the police. And that's what community policing is about developing relationships between the police and the citizens, so that instead of the police sitting back listening to the radio, waiting for 911 calls, that you get involved and you're proactive and you're working on prevention of crime and not responding, and making sure that the police department looks like the people who are being policed.
I love your comment of my community, my responsibility. I really, there's so much behind that. And what we have too many times are people saying, it's not my job, it's not my responsibility. Somebody else has to do that. You know, I'm not gonna worry about that. But if you're ever gonna get real change, every person has to say, hey, I can make a difference and I can do something differently that will improve my community. And I love that message that you're preaching.
Yeah, Michael Jackson's piece, the man in the mirror, or the woman in the mirror. You know, we can't say that now. You know, when I was in the 3rd grade, I had a teacher who had this strategy of making sure the room was clean every evening before we went home. And she would say, class, I want everybody to look around your desk. And if there's any paper, pick it up. Okay, so when everybody does that, guess what? The room is almost clean. You know, you have just a little area left, but you know, it's like my friend Youth Cromwell, the minister, the Methodist minister, she said that you heard the story about the fish in the bread. And in an interpretation she gave in her sermon was that, you know, the multitudes were fed with these few fish in the loaves of bread because actually there were many people out there who had stuff, but as we say in the neighborhood, they wasn't giving it up. And I think a classic example is that in April, we were trying to run around trying to figure out how to find some toilet tissue, and we couldn't find any in our giant. And so what I was talking to one of my neighbors, and he said, "You looking for toilet tissue?" He said, "I got some." You know, and I said, "How?" You know, he said, "I got 2 cases." So what happened was that you had somebody who was hoarding, and they had more than their fair share, and other people who didn't have enough. And I think, to me, that's an analogy of what we have going on today, where you have CEOs who are making nearly 400 times what their workers make. And you know, this situation has to change, so we can reset the button, and we need new leadership, and it's time for a change.
Let me ask a question about Leadership Greater Washington. Have any Leadership Greater Washington members reached out to you? Have you reached out to them in the last few months to sort of help you through all this stuff? And
yeah, I've been working. Some of you probably know Alex Padro, who I forget the class that Alex is in. And
he's in the grade 08, and he just gave a shout out to you a little while ago.
Yeah, and we have other people who've done things. I talked with George Jones and you know, Faye Coleman and I talk from time to time. And actually, I should give a shout out to Faye, because she was the one who reached out to me and said, "Look, based on your history and your track record, we need you to become re-engaged with what's going on. And we need to make sure that we go forward with all of these things, and they're wonderful things that are happening. Many of the Leadership Washington alums are involved in business. You know, I was, you know, involved in 1963 trying to go to a library, but we want to move beyond just trying to go to a library or sit next to a white person at a diner. We want to talk about equity now in terms of, you know, business. You know, we have hotels and other things going on and all kinds of things happening. And we have Leadership Washington alumni all over the map in any kind of thing. And so my thing is that unto whom much is given, much is required. Our community, our responsibility. And what I'm saying today, we've got to help our political leaders, because sometimes they believe that our neighborhoods and our community stops at those lines where it says District Montgomery County, District Prince George's County, District Alexandria. You know, we are part of one region, and we've got to work to try and deal with that, because this virus showed us that it doesn't respect those little boundaries that we put on those maps. You know, the air we breathe, the water we drink, all of this is an example of those kind of things.
So we've got a few questions here from people saying, how can we help you? What can we do to help you with what you're working on, or to help advance Shaw, or help advance the city or the region?
I think I was telling you that I've been trying to retire, but people keep saying you can't do this. I've got about 3 or 4 clients who keep saying, you know, don't give me up, give the other guy up. You know, but I want us to see some of the kind of things that we talked about years ago. I should mention, by the way, one of the things that really helped us in Shaw make a lot of progress with things like the convention center, the Marriott Marquis, and other things was Marion Barry. You know, he was very much instrumental in making sure that we had the minority business program and the first source program, making sure that projects that take place, you know, in our city include people in the neighborhood, so that, you know, what happened in the 50s when urban renewal became Negro removal is not a reality. We've got to set some metrics, Doug, some goals and policies that we need to hit. I'm very proud that I worked on the Marriott Marquis Hotel, that we ended up with some 200 plus DC residents working there. Those are the kind of projects that we got to do when projects take place wherever they are. We need to make sure that the people in the neighborhoods near those projects benefit from those projects. And that means jobs, that means training, that means business and contracting opportunities to take place. And also, we've got some people who are on the verge of being left behind. In my conversation with George Jones with Bread for the City, you know, they are looking at some financial issues now. You know, as one of the biggest industries in DC after the federal government is hospitality and tourism. Well, many of the hotels, Doug, are closed, including the Marquis, the Renaissance, and some of the others. And so those tax dollars that would normally come from those things are not there. And I think the CFO for DC forecast about a $780 million deficit for this fiscal year, which ends the September 30th, and about the same amount for the first quarter of next year. And so we're facing some difficult times ahead. And to me, this is the example of the fish and the loaves of bread, where we may need some people other than government is coming forward. So I think it's a collaboration. Breadforthecity.org, you know, is a group that I work to help. There's some other organizations in the neighborhood that are doing things. Shaw Main Street, we have many restaurants, and I think in a conversation recently with Alex, he mentioned that there may be 40 or 50% of the restaurants in our neighborhood that may be closed permanently as a result of this pandemic. And so if you have the ability to buy something or to go by and shop at a restaurant, we've got wonderful places. I work very closely with Industrial Bank on U Street. I'm happy that Industrial Bank, Lee's Florist, Ben's Chili Bowl are still there, and they've survived, you know, the crime and the drugs and the metro construction, and we hope they're going to survive. I'm happy to know that people like Sankofa up on Georgia Avenue are still there, and what the government had to do was to give them some adjustment in their taxes, because the tax structure was killing them. You got all of these high rises and condominiums going up around them, but they have like small retail outlets that, you know, can't compete. And so there's got to be a different standard for the long-time business people, just like a different standard for the long-time residents who are senior citizens who can't afford their property taxes continuing to go up.
Ibrahim, thank you very much for this conversation. Marieva Candon has sent out several shout outs in the chat room during the conversation today. Thanking you.
Yeah.
For that.
Yeah,
And,
thank you. People like Mary are excellent. We're trying to get engaged with this campaign. Again, we've got 69 days left, and the question is, what are we going to do about it? We've got to make sure that people show up, vote, and also because the president will need 270 electoral votes, we can't just be content with the District of Columbia. We've got to try and get people to talk to their relatives and friends in other states so that we can get the required number. Because you remember, last time we had 69 million people who voted for Hillary. She won the popular vote, but she did not win the Electoral College. So thank you very much.
I will leave that as the final word for this conversation today. Thank you so much again. Great chatting with you. I really enjoyed the history lesson and a lot of other comments that you had today. Thank you for being part of Leadership Greater Washington.
Okay, thank you, Doug.
This Frontline conversation, we've got another one coming up soon, so stay tuned for more Frontline conversations with Leadership Greater Washington. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome.